Hello, my friends. A strategic assessment of the Russia-Ukraine war and the illusion of negotiated peace. The war in Ukraine must be examined not through slogans or emotional framing, but through the realities of intelligence operations, battlefield adaptation, geography, logistics, and power politics. Any serious analysis that ignores these elements inevitably collapses into propaganda. What follows is a grounded examination of how the conflict is evolving, why negotiations remain structurally impossible at this stage, and why Russia continues to hold the strategic initiative despite mounting rhetoric about peace. Over the past several days, multiple intelligence operations have occurred that illustrate the nature of the conflict beyond the front lines. In Moscow, a senior Russian military officer, General Fanil Sarov, head of the Operational Training Department, was killed in a car bombing. This was not an isolated incident. Similar targeted attacks against senior Russian military personnel have occurred previously, both within Russia and elsewhere. These operations involve agents and partisan networks rather than conventional military action. What is notable, however, is the asymmetry in intelligence focus. Russian intelligence activity appears to concentrate less on internal sabotage within Ukraine and more on industrial targets, gray zone operations, and strategic infrastructure across Europe. This does not mean Russian intelligence is absent in Ukraine. Rather, Ukraine has become saturated with counterintelligence assets from dozens of foreign states. Ukraine is not operating with the intelligence capacity of a normal nation-state, but with an unprecedented concentration of Western intelligence resources layered on top of its own services. Russia, by contrast, relies largely on its own state apparatus. Recent footage released by Ukrainian intelligence claims the destruction of Su-27 and Su-30 aircraft at an airfield, allegedly carried out by agents or partisans. The visual evidence circulating online does not conclusively demonstrate the total destruction of these aircraft, but the messaging itself is part of a broader information war designed to offset deteriorating battlefield realities. One of the most widely mocked developments has been the reported use of horses by Russian forces near the front line. On social media, Ukrainian commentators frame this as evidence of desperation or technological regression. Such reactions reveal a profound misunderstanding of warfare. Nearly every innovation on this battlefield, from cage armor to motorcycles, scooters, thermal blankets, and improvised logistics, was initially ridiculed before being adopted by the opposing side. The use of horses is not a sign of collapse. It is a tactical experiment. In terrain that is heavily surveilled by drones, vehicles are often more vulnerable than mounted infantry. Any experienced infantryman understands that a moderately trained rider can traverse terrain inaccessible even to expert motorcycle operators, particularly in forested, hilly, or muddy environments. The idea that modern warfare has no place for low-signature mobility is disproven daily by the realities of drone-dominated battlefields. The Russian military has consistently demonstrated a willingness to experiment under fire. Some methods fail, others succeed and are rapidly refined. This mirrors historical patterns seen in World War I, where soldiers improvised solutions to counter machine guns, artillery, and emerging technologies. Drones today represent a similarly transformative force, compelling adaptation that often appears unconventional to outside observers. Turning to the battlefield itself, the map tells a story that official Ukrainian statements cannot obscure. In the Pokrovsk sector, Ukrainian mapping sources themselves designate most of the area as gray zone, meaning contested or lost control. Independent mapping projects and geolocated evidence indicate that Russian forces dominate the initiative across this sector. Ukrainian claims that the situations under control mirror the same narrative used during the collapse of Bakhmut, where optimism rapidly inverted into panic once reality could no longer be concealed. The same pattern repeats elsewhere. In Kupiansk, Ukrainian forces have achieved limited tactical counterattacks, but control remains fragmented. In the southern sectors around Huliaipol and Orikhiv, Ukrainian sources claim stabilization, yet their own maps show expanding gray zones and Russian penetration. Russian advances across multiple fronts demonstrate not just territorial gains, but the erosion of Ukraine's ability to stabilize any line for a sustained period. This matters because negotiations are not conducted in abstraction. They codify battlefield outcomes. The party with the initiative has no incentive to concede ground or accept conditions that negate its advantage. Russia is advancing faster now than at earlier stages of the war, while Ukraine faces compounding manpower shortages, reliance on conscription, and growing rates of unauthorized absences. These issues are no longer openly discussed within Ukraine, not because they are resolved, but because they are politically toxic. The discussion of peace repeatedly fails on two fundamental hurdles. First, Russia does not yet perceive the cost of continuation as exceeding the benefits. On the contrary, Russia sees its adversaries fracturing. U.S. commitment is waning. European unity is visibly eroding. NATO cohesion depends overwhelmingly on American power, and that power is increasingly redirected toward domestic priorities and the Indo-Pacific. Second, Ukraine and its European backers refuse to accept the military realities of the battlefield. They propose security guarantees, force sizes, and post-war arrangements that are entirely disconnected from demographic, economic, and strategic constraints. An 800,000-strong Ukrainian standing army is not sustainable by any realistic measure. Even without Russian-imposed limits, Ukraine lacks the population base, economic output, and institutional capacity to maintain such a force long-term. The fixation on labels NATO versus non-NATO security frameworks misses the core issue. Russia is not fighting over semantics. It is fighting to prevent Western military infrastructure from embedding itself in Ukraine. Rebranding NATO presence under different terminology does not alter that reality. Meanwhile, U.S. interest in Europe continues to decline. This is not speculation. It is observable in funding debates, political rhetoric, and strategic signaling. The emerging dispute over Greenland illustrates the widening gap between American and European priorities. Under the banner of national security, Washington increasingly asserts unilateral interests that directly conflict with European sovereignty. This is not about morality. It is about power. Europe, in severing trade and energy ties with Russia, has not increased its sovereignty. It has transferred dependency from one supplier to another, this time the United States. Sovereignty rests on three pillars: trade, energy, and defense. Europe now relies on Washington across all three. That dependence limits European autonomy far more than any prior relationship with Russia ever did. The irony is unavoidable. In the name of sovereignty, Europe has become strategically subordinate. Denmark's vulnerability in the Greenland dispute exemplifies the risks of abandoning balanced relationships. These dynamics are not hypothetical. They are unfolding in real time. Russia, for its part, understands that war is politics by other means. A military conclusion does not require total occupation. It requires reaching a point where the adversary lacks the capacity or will to reverse outcomes. Whether through exhaustion, deterrence, or political fracture, the objective is achieved when resistance becomes unsustainable. The most dangerous outcome is mutual exhaustion, which historically breeds resentment and instability rather than peace. World War I did not truly end in 1918. It merely mutated into a more destructive conflict 2 decades later. Ignoring battlefield realities in favor of ideological narratives risks repeating that pattern. Until Russia perceives continuation as disadvantageous, and until Ukraine and Europe accept the limits imposed by military reality, negotiations will remain performative. They will not end the war. They will merely postpone recognition of its trajectory. The uncomfortable truth is that wars do not end because one side wishes them to. They end when power balances dictate terms. At present, that balance continues to favor Russia. A single, continuous analysis. What we are witnessing today is not a series of disconnected headlines, but the slow unmasking of a strategic reality that Washington, Brussels, and much of the Western media have tried desperately to obscure. The Ukraine war, the Greenland rhetoric, the naval fantasies of American rearmament, and the visible cracks inside NATO are all symptoms of the same underlying condition: the collapse of Western strategic coherence in the face of Russian resilience, and long-term planning. The United States, under Donald Trump, presents itself as a master negotiator, a neutral broker capable of ending wars through sheer force of will. Yet when stripped of slogans and theatrical confidence, the contradictions are impossible to ignore. One cannot credibly claim neutrality in Ukraine while simultaneously arming one side, controlling the alliance that delivers those weapons, and openly boasting about initiating earlier escalatory steps. Mediation requires distance. Washington has none. Ukraine was never a standalone conflict. From its inception, it functioned as a proxy war, one designed to weaken Russia strategically, economically, and politically, without committing NATO troops directly. That project has failed. Not rhetorically, not emotionally, but materially. Russia adapted faster than expected, industrialized its war economy, stabilized its energy exports, and reshaped global trade routes. The West, meanwhile, discovered that its own industrial base was hollowed out by decades of outsourcing, financialization, and ideological complacency. This reality explains the increasingly frantic tone coming from Washington. The sudden obsession with big, beautiful battleships, hypersonic dreams, and futuristic weapons systems is not a sign of strength. It is a confession of anxiety. Building such platforms by 2030 is not merely ambitious, it borders on fantasy. Shipyards are understaffed, behind schedule, and structurally incapable of meeting existing commitments. Hypersonic weapons remain an unresolved technical challenge for the United States, while Russia has already fielded and operationalized them. Strategic credibility is not declared. It is demonstrated. Against this backdrop, the renewed fixation on Greenland must be understood not as a bold strategic masterstroke, but as a search for an easy geopolitical victory. Greenland is framed as national security, yet the argument collapses under scrutiny. The United States already dominates the North Atlantic militarily. What Greenland truly represents is optics, a visible assertion of power that can be sold domestically as strength at a time when foreign policy results elsewhere are ambiguous at best. The reaction from Europe exposes a deeper weakness. The European Union invokes sovereignty, international law, and treaties, yet conspicuously avoids naming the United States directly when those principles are challenged. This silence is not accidental. It reflects dependency. The EU cannot confront Washington because it surrendered strategic autonomy long ago, particularly when it chose to sever pragmatic relations with Russia and China in favor of ideological alignment. This self-inflicted isolation is now producing absurd outcomes. On one hand, Brussels proclaims moral outrage over Russian energy. On the other, European states quietly cooperate with Russian state-linked entities to sustain their nuclear infrastructure. The contradiction is not hidden, it is normalized. Hypocrisy has become policy. Nowhere is this dysfunction clearer than in Ukraine itself. Negotiations stall not because Russia is unclear about its objectives, but because Western leaders refuse to acknowledge them publicly. Donbass is not a bargaining chip, it is a strategic red line rooted in demographics, security depth, and historical continuity. Even Western officials privately concede what they cannot say aloud: Russia will control Donbass, whether through negotiation or continued military pressure. Delay only increases the cost. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, often cited as a sticking point, is another example of manufactured ambiguity. The real issue is not management, but control. Infrastructure of that magnitude cannot exist in a legal vacuum inside an active war zone. Russia understands this. Ukraine's backers avoid stating it because doing so would require admitting that the battlefield realities no longer align with their narratives. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian military faces growing operational strain, drone saturation campaigns, energy infrastructure strikes, and the opening of new axes of pressure are not symbolic acts. They are designed to exhaust logistics, fracture morale, and force difficult decisions, blackouts, evacuations, and territorial contraction are not signs of resilience, they are indicators of a system under sustained stress. As the conflict drags on, the broader NATO framework shows signs of fatigue. Quiet admissions from European leaders that Russia poses no imminent threat to NATO are not accidental slips. They are signals. The rhetoric of inevitable war is being dialed back because those closest to the consequences understand what escalation would mean. A direct NATO-Russia conflict would not remain conventional. Everyone knows this. The question is no longer whether war is desirable, but whether continued denial is sustainable. Finland's situation illustrates the cost of strategic miscalculation. Economic damage, border instability, and social disruption have replaced the promised security dividends of NATO expansion. Even media narratives attempting to blame wildlife patterns on Russia reveal how deeply politicization has infected public discourse. When wolves become geopolitical actors, credibility has already been lost. Through all of this, Russia remains the constant variable. It has not needed theatrical announcements or symbolic land grabs. Its strategy is incremental, grounded, and aligned with material capacity. While the West debates optics and messaging, Russia consolidates facts on the ground, military, economic, and diplomatic. The uncomfortable truth is that the Ukraine war has accelerated a multipolar world faster than Washington intended. Sanctions failed to isolate Russia. Energy leverage shifted eastward. Global South neutrality hardened into quiet resistance. What was meant to be a demonstration of Western unity has instead exposed fragmentation, dependency, and strategic exhaustion. In the end, the question is not whether negotiations will occur, but on whose terms time, resources, and industrial depth favor Russia. Every delay erodes Ukraine's position and weakens Western leverage. Reality does not wait for talking points to catch up. History rarely announces turning points with clarity. More often, it whispers them through contradictions. Today, those contradictions are no longer subtle. They are structural. And they point unmistakably in one direction. The strategic initiative has shifted, and it is not in Washington, Brussels, or Kyiv. The defining mistake of the Western approach to Ukraine has never been tactical. It has been philosophical. Washington and its allies convinced themselves that reality could be managed through narrative, that perception could substitute for power, and that time would automatically work against Russia. None of those assumptions survived contact with events. Russia did not rush. It did not panic. It did not gamble its future on short-term optics. It absorbed pressure, recalibrated, and methodically reshaped the battlefield, military, economic, and diplomatic. While Western leaders cycled through slogans and deadlines, Russia built redundancy. While sanctions were celebrated as decisive blows, Russia redirected trade, stabilized its currency, and expanded strategic partnerships outside the Atlantic sphere. What was supposed to be isolation became acceleration toward a post-Western global order. The Ukraine conflict has exposed an uncomfortable truth the West has avoided for decades. Power rests on production, cohesion, and endurance, not on press conferences or moral posturing. NATO's arsenals are finite. Its political unity is conditional. Its industrial base, once unrivaled, now struggles to sustain prolonged high-intensity conflict. Russia, by contrast, prepared for precisely this kind of confrontation. It planned for attrition because it understood history. Wars are not won by enthusiasm. They are won by logistics and patience. As negotiations drift in circles, the illusion of leverage erodes. Each month that passes without a settlement strengthens Russia's position and weakens Ukraine's. This is not ideology. It is arithmetic. Territory lost under fire is rarely regained at the table. Infrastructure destroyed is not rebuilt by declarations. Demographics, energy flows, and military geography impose limits that no amount of diplomatic theater can override. The West still speaks as if outcomes are optional. as if Russia can be persuaded to abandon core security interests through pressure alone. That belief is not only false, it is dangerous. It prolongs a war that Ukraine cannot win and risks escalation that Europe cannot contain. The quiet shift in tone from several European leaders is not coincidence. It is recognition, however delayed, that the path being followed leads nowhere sustainable. History will not judge this conflict by who spoke most eloquently or sanctioned most aggressively. It will judge who understood reality first. Russia did not need to convince the world of its resolve, it demonstrated it. The West, meanwhile, talked itself into believing that resolve could be manufactured on demand. In the end, wars conclude not when one side exhausts its rhetoric, but when it accepts the limits of its power. That moment is approaching. Whether it arrives through negotiation or continued attrition remains uncertain. What is certain is that the strategic balance has already shifted. Ukraine was meant to be the arena where Russia was weakened beyond recovery. Instead, it has become the arena where Western assumptions were dismantled. The longer this truth is resisted, the higher the cost will be for Ukraine, for Europe, and for the credibility of the Western order itself. History is unforgiving to illusions, and it has already begun to render its verdict.